Hello, beautiful people. I am Oliver Perrin for Semiagog, joined today by Apostolic Majesty, and very, very happy that it is so. If there are any problems or issues with the audio, do let me know in the chat. Hopefully this is coming through as it should. I'm sorry that I'm just a couple of minutes late here. That's entirely my fault. I was a bit late getting started. We are going to be discussing attempts to react, attempts to restore, attempted restorations in history. Now, this is a part of the strategy series because it would seem to make sense that we should look back and see what history can teach us about attempts to restore things in the past. You know, perhaps we can abstract some lessons from this to some extent. That will be upon all of you, dear viewers, to do so, and to a considerable extent, it will be on me. Before I jump into a proper introduction, let me get through the boilerplate stuff very quickly. Follow this channel, Semiagog, as well as a Safer Space. You can do that on BitChute. You can do that on Odyssey. You can do that with both channels here on YouTube. There's also Minds, there's Gab, there's Telegram, there's Twitter. For those who wish to support the channel, there is GoFundMe, and there is Subscribestar. These Praetorian Chads are the ones who are responsible for making this channel happen. Let me just pull this screen up and share it so that these mighty names will not be lost to posterity. Let's see, where's my screen share? There we are. Sorry, ladies and gentlemen. Once a boomer, always a boomer. These are the people who make it possible. So thanks very much to them. There is a GoFundMe and Subscribestar if anyone else would like to support the channel. And again, thank you all very much. So yeah, I think I covered most of it. I'm not going to show my books because I would like to leave more time for Apostolic Majesty to discuss his points. Very happy to have him on here. I very much want to recommend his history channel. You can find that under Apostolic Majesty. I would be remiss also if I did not mention his co-host, Columba, or his permanent guest host. I'm not sure how that's described, but it's a great channel. He is part of the crew, for those who don't know him already, that often appear over on AA's channel. Others that are just great include like Pharaoh with his channel with discussion of art and culture. So really can't recommend these guys enough, and Apostolic Majesty himself enough. So very quickly to get started, in the first episode of this series, I sort of justified the exercise. You know, the idea that there is value in pursuing a communication strategy, and the idea that, you know, since I have a background in communications, I can sort of midwife to some extent this exercise. And this exercise, were I doing it for a client professionally, would involve bringing in subject matter experts in the early phases to sort of prime everyone, to get them thinking in new ways, to see what lessons can be drawn, and just to sort of get everyone ready. In the second episode, I spoke with Josh Neal. This was on the subject of overcoming psychological resistance, particularly guilt and denial in what gets called the conversion process with you know, marketing and advertising and all the rest. And tonight, as I said, we're going to be talking about people attempting to restore order or stability or traditions in the past, sometimes all of these things, and how their efforts unfolded, whether they were successful or not. And hopefully, in the course of his presentation of material, you know, as AM is laying this out for us, hopefully I'll be able to draw some lessons from it. Hopefully you will be as well. And this can serve as a kind of introductory exercise for these other things that are to come, including some, you know, let's call them multiplayer workshop sessions. But for now, that serves as introduction, long-winded as it is. Apostolic Majesty, thank you very much for being with us. And how would you get us started, sir?
Well, first I want to say just thank you very much for that introduction, and shilling my channel is very much appreciated. And you know, again, your support is very much appreciated. So thank you so much for that, Semiagog. In terms of starting this, I mean, you mentioned sort of reaction. I've also mentioned in the title of this episode, restoration. In terms of reaction, the idea of a reactionary is actually again, comes out of the French Revolution. I believe it's Comte de les Arcanaux, who is one who popularizes that term. It's basically a derogatory term applied to royalists after the ascension of the Directoire in 1797. However, when I'm going to be using the term reactionary, I'm going to be using it sort of much more broadly than that historical context, although I will be referring to that historical context. When it comes to restorations, in preparation for this discussion, I've categorized restoration in 8 forms. And 3 of these forms aren't going to be really relevant to this discussion, but I'll just illustrate them so people can understand what I'm talking about. The first restoration, the simplest form of restoration, is simply the restoration of a person into a position of power. So this would be, historical example would be, say, for example, Henry VI of England, who was temporarily deposed by Edward IV and then would become king for 1 year during the War of the Roses. Another example being Justinian II of the Eastern Roman Empire, or sometimes erroneously called the Byzantine Empire, who would be deposed for 10 years and would come back and unleash a series of retributive acts. Another form of restoration is simply territorial restoration. So this would be your Aurelian reconquering the Palmyrene and the Gallic empires, your Justinian taking over Italy, taking over North Africa, taking over parts of Spain, or, you know, in a more modern context, it would be France and Germany routinely swapping over possession of Alsace Lorraine. Another important point to mention in terms of restorations is, of course, this idea of independence as being a form of restoration. So I would define this as being, you know, a continuous existing idea of a state or a nation with a consistent ethnic group, which has essentially been occupied by another power or amalgamated into another power structure, and it achieves its independence. And again, you know, I don't really need to list off the examples. There are hundreds of examples of this throughout history. You know, Polish independence after World War I, Hungarian independence, you know, Bulgarian independence during the 1870s, for example. You know, the list goes on and on. So I don't really need to go more into that. So getting to the reactionary part, and this sort of brings me back to your original idea of reaction, and taking this back to the context of the French Revolution, is the idea of regime restoration. And this is where you have a antithetical regime that comes in, that deposes a pre-existing order and replaces it with a quote unquote progressive order, even though that, again, I'm using that very loosely. And then you would have a regime that restores, you know, in many cases, it's the same family, the same royal line that is restored, the same monarchical system is restored. And again, it tries to imitate the same constitutional structure, the same system of legal or precedent that had been established before this, you can say, sort of interloper antithetical regime. So one example, of course, is the Stewart Restoration. For people who don't know, the English Civil War resulted in the deposition of King Charles and his execution, and the replacement by a rump parliament and eventually by a military dictatorship under Oliver Cromwell. And in 1660, due to the army, you know, withdrawing their support from the Commonwealth, King Charles II would be restored, who was the son of Charles I, and he would basically restore Britain as if the Commonwealth had virtually never happened. Moving this more into my own wheelhouse, which is the time after the French Revolution, we're going to talk about the Bourbon Restoration. Now, the Bourbon Restoration is, you know, not unique. It's part of a generalized series of restorations during this time. Just to give you a bit of context, in 1789, you have the French Revolution. In 1792, you have the deposition of King Louis XVI, and he is executed next year. Whilst at the same time, you see a series of wars conducted by the French Republic and later by Napoleon Bonaparte, which will engulf Europe for the next 20 years, result in the complete redrawing of the map, the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire, the invasion of Spain, the invasion of Russia, you know, the consolidation of Germany and Italy into more cohesive, smaller states. And so in the wake of this, in the wake of Napoleon's defeat after the 1812 campaign, after the Battle of Leipzig, after the Treaty of Fontainebleau, you have something called the Congress of Vienna, orchestrated by, among others, typically Clemens von Metternich. And this is a European attempt to restore many of the pre-revolutionary governments which you had before this before the French Revolution. So in France, you have the restoration of Louis XVIII, Louis XVIII being the brother of Louis XVI. However, I think it's also important to note that as a common theme that we're going to see throughout this discussion is that these restorations, especially after the French Revolution, aren't pure restorations. When Louis XVIII becomes king, he institutes something called the July Charter, which provides for a limited form of constitutional monarchy. And in response to this, the ultra-royalists in his own camp, led by his own brother, Charles de Comte d'Artois, who would later become Charles X, or Charles X, would rebel against this. And when he would succeed his brother, he would attempt a more, you could say, honest restoration of the previous system, which is derisively known as the Ansion Regime. Again, all of these ideas come back from the French Revolution and attempt to deride the French monarchy up until that point. But this wasn't, unique to France. This was also happening in Spain. Spain, of course, had been invaded in 1808. And you had King Ferdinand VII being deposed. You had a so-called liberal monarchy under Napoleon's older brother Joseph. And in 1813, thanks primarily to the British and the Spanish guerrillas, you had the restoration of the Spanish monarchy and the tearing up of a 1812 liberal constitution. In Germany, you wouldn't have the restoration of the Holy Roman Empire, but you would have the restoration of some form of German confederation. And many of the princes who had lost their thrones would, regain, various territories. Prussia, say, for example, gained vast amounts of territory, again, also coinciding with my previous definition of territorial restoration. And in Italy, primarily, the French and French influence will be driven out. So the kingdoms of Savoy, which had been, annexed by France, were restored. The Bourbons in the Two Sicilies, and by the Two Sicilies, I mean the Kingdom of Naples and the Kingdom of Sicily, were restored. The temporal power of the popes in the Papal States were also restored. And this, cements another feature of this idea of regime restoration. This is the time of Chateaubriand. This is the time of de Maistre. The idea of reinforcing the so-called old regime by wedding it to the idea of the Catholic Church as a pillar of hierarchy and social order and morality against progressivism. And so we see this in France with Charles X's attempts to prevent, again, the use of blasphemy, profanity, and sacrilege, attacking churches, as we can see today, just drawing a modern comparison. We pretty much have a church going up in France every week at this point. Things, even the charge of the death penalty for the desecration of the host and the monstrance, for Catholics. You have the preparation of the Holy Sacrament in one of these beautiful containers, which are again meant to mimic the sun. And attacking the host was again considered an offence worthy of the death penalty during this time, to really emphasize that France is a Catholic country. And this spread throughout most of Europe at this point, and you could say it was one of the most successful restorations in human history, not just in terms of restoring the old rulers, as I mentioned, but also in restoring the foundations of the pre-French Revolution society. However, there were certain cracks in the system, namely being that once you release these revolutionary ideas, once you have a elite, a bourgeoisie, who have been wedded to this idea of, liberté, égalité, fraternité, once they are beholden to this idea of constitutional monarchy, once they adopt, atheism and, aggressive secularization, the separation of church and state, all of these ideas will come back throughout European history, and they will gain more and more prominence as we go along.
So this ties to your point that you sort of underscored at the outset, that these regime restorations are rarely, if ever, pure, because we've sort of seen a weaponized sort of rabid laïcité, in France even today, and this sort of overweening secular state. No?
Oh yes, absolutely. Just to reiterate, One other key feature of the French Revolution was, of course, centralization. Under the French Revolution, we had the abolition of the Généralité and the various regional parlements, and replacing it with the department system, where you have centralized administration. And the very important thing to recognize about the department system is that departments were allocated based on geographic features. So any association with a region, with a particular dialect, with a particular history, with a particular local institution, or even a history of independent statehood, all of these things were eradicated through the use of the department system. And invariably, this form of centralization was very attractive to certain post-French Revolutionary rulers, among others, the Austrians. And so there was no real desire to return to a less centralized, a more historical system of administration, pre-French Revolution in that sense. They wanted to keep the benefits of the French Revolution, i.e., a more efficient and necessarily oppressive state with means to conscript more and more and more troops. And again, this is the sort of contradiction. At the one hand, Metternich would need a strong and effective state in order to crack down on certain liberal organizations, in particular Freemasonic organizations and various liberal clubs. But at the same time, this encroachment and expansion of state power was a legacy of the French Revolution. So that's the irony in the way the legacy of the French Revolution is used to oppress the spirit of the French Revolution and prevent these liberal groups, young Europeans, Mazzini, etc., spreading and also adopting this new idea, which is nationalism. And when I mean nationalism, I'm not suggesting that there haven't been, ethnic predilections to groups. Of course there have, throughout the entire history. What I mean by nationalism is a centralizing, all-encompassing identity based on a ethnicity, which is, really part of an imagined community at this point, rather than historical ties. So this is part of, the French desire to centralize and make uniform, and create a universal idea of French statehood. This idea is unleashed by the French Revolution, and it is present in all of the countries in which the French had, expanded, Germany and Italy in particular. So the new order is designed around a explicit rejection of this new system, this totalizing, universalizing form of ethnic cohesion, which is the modern nation state. And so, Metternich would refer to Italy, for example, as that mere geographic entity. And in Germany, the German order would again be reorganized on the traditional power of the House of Wittelsbach and Bavaria in the south, and Prussian domination in the north. But again, there's a weakness to this. Before the French Revolution, the Kleinstaaterei, or the smaller German states, numbered in the hundreds, whereas as a result of the French Revolution, they were reduced, I believe, to the 30s, and that same number was also kept by the post-French Revolutionary governments as well. So, many, as you can see, a lot of Napoleonic French Revolutionary elements persist into this, so-called reactionary age. Even the idea of elevating Bavaria and Württemberg and Saxony to the position of king, that is the result of the French Revolution. These were not kingdoms before, and I think I've done a stream myself on the age of Metternich, and a reactionary author who was writing in the 1930s, known as de Penchant, argues that the fatal flaw in the system was the fact that the Holy Roman Empire was not restored. And so with it, all its, incredibly complex procedures, rituals, the sanctification of a universalizing sort of Catholic hierarchy in the form of the emperor, all of these things had been destroyed by the French Revolution, even though they had withered and declined, for hundreds of years before that point. These things were not restored. And so the Austrian emperor never had the same sort of power, you could argue, that he had all the prestige that he'd had prior to this revolution. So again, a lot of, you can almost, I hesitate to use Hegel and his deterministic view on history. But you can say that this is a form of the Hegelian dialectic, where you do have a synthesis of thesis and antithesis.
Yeah, that immediately occurred to me. It's actually my first abstracted note, that as you pointed out, the restorations are rarely, if ever, pure, including an admixture. So it just immediately came to mind, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, with the dialectical progression you mentioned. And the other thing that really clearly stands out here for me is that this imposition requires centralization of control. I have a friend, he's a Channel Jolly scholar. He's always talking about how there's always a top-down imposition with this sort of socialistic game playing, the masters of the universe nonsense. Mm-hmm. He likes to express it with the distinction between sort of top-down clerical control within the Catholic Church versus the sort of grassroots bottom-up lay brotherhoods. But in any case, there is a top-down imposition that comes with these revolutions, no matter how much they claim that the people are clamoring for them. And any reaction to that necessarily also involves centralization and imposition, if only to attempt, however imperfectly, to return things to where we started. So when you talk about like the centralization of power, I've talked to a number of French people, and they're constantly talking about this just enormous influence of Paris upon everything across the entire country. And that it's, despite the fact that there are other big cities, it is just unquestionably the dominant force. And then, culturally and in any number of other respects. And you see the ways in which, Brittany or the Vendée and the rest were just sort of, literally just murdered into line,
Absolutely.
To be forced to go with this whole role. So I guess the way to summarize this point is that the structure of the centralization and the top-down imposition, it's not only established, but it's reified, or it's doubled, so to speak, by any attempted reaction to the initial instance or the revolutionary instance.
And I'm going to again make an even more controversial point, which is again the need for power in order to strengthen this entire system of reaction. My thesis regarding the Age of Metternich is that it ultimately relied on the goodwill of a new system of power, which was based on the concert system, the concert of Europe. However, this system collapsed virtually at the onset, partly because various members of the concert of Europe, and just to give you an overview, the principal members being France, Prussia, Austria, Russia, and Great Britain, had no investment in maintaining this reactionary post-revolutionary settlement in some cases. The first example being Britain. Britain, from the outset, began to foment revolution in Spanish America, which at the time was fighting against, fighting for independence against Spain. Spain, which had, almost been totally destroyed as an empire during the Napoleonic invasions. That would go further to British supporting the liberalizing faction of the monarchy under Isabella against the more reactionary monarchy under the Carlists. On the other hand, you also have the unstable situation in France as well. I mentioned Talleyrand. A main factor that distinguishes Talleyrand from Metternich is the fact that Talleyrand betrayed so many governments that he was a member of. So I believe he was a member of the Directory. I think even before then, he was a member of the National Convention, a member of the Directory. He was a member of the Consulate. He was a member of the Empire. He was a member of the Restoration. And finally, he was a member of the Orleans monarchy. And this again is where this system of reaction really breaks down. I mentioned Charles X. In his attempt to go further and control press in the same way that Metternich could control press within the Austrian Empire, the so-called Ordinances of Saint-Cloud, there was a Parisian revolt which had been fomented by Louis Philippe. And, going back to, this is ironically another form of restoration, because Louis Philippe is the son of Louis Égalité, who was the cousin of Louis XVI, and had hosted all of these liberals and revolutionaries in the Élysée Palace. Again, another allusion to the modern Republic of France and its original association with the revolution. And he would attempt to restore the weird, unhappy monarchy between 1789 and 1792, where France was officially essentially a constitutional monarchy, where the monarch was a citizen king, as bizarre and absurd as that is. And Louis Philippe would refer to himself as the first citizen of the French as king of the French. And this really sort of undermines the notion of reaction, because it is removing, as Evola would consider and de Maistre would consider, the divine essence of monarchy, whose legitimacy comes from the church, if not God. Once you remove this and you begin a form of popular sovereignty, then you can no longer reject again the clamor for democracy and liberalism as we go further down the line. So on the one hand, you've already lost Britain and France from the system. On the other, Prussia and Austria together aren't strong enough to prevent the various outbreaks of revolution in 1848, which among other things is fomented by these various liberal clubs and Masonic societies. And it is Russia who provides the stability to restore these regimes after having collapsed, in the wake of, again, the perseverance of all of these ideas which have been floating around since the French Revolution. To make things worse, not only do we have states betraying the core principles of this general reaction in Europe, but we actually have states actively fomenting it and going along with it. So the perennial example would be Savoy. Savoy would originally ally with the Revolutionary Party in 1848, and under Cavour they would ally with them again in 1859 to bring about the creation of Italy at the expense of the Austrians, and create a secular liberal monarchy in Italy, which would destroy the temporal power of the popes. At the same time, Russia would be betraying its commitment to this stabilization of Europe by wanting to destroy the integrity of the Ottoman Empire in the Crimean Wars. And as a result of this, we have the breakdown of the so-called Holy Alliance between Prussia, between Austria, and between Russia, which is the hallmark of power within the system, preserving it. So I think, as you can see, even with the centralization of power as a result of the French Revolution, which itself is a corruption of the older reactionary form, which makes it an impure form of reaction, you also have a lack of power and subversion within these national governments that helped routinely undermine it, to the point where we eventually get to World War I.
Yeah, the point there. And my understanding of the history in this respect is somewhat spotty. I'm familiar with Nicholas I primarily because he oversaw most of the violent push into the Caucasus. But as I recall, he was very reactionary. He made his in some sense, and he made his very traditional in terms of monarchical power or autocratic power, and he made his troops available to governments that were being faced by this sort of wave of revolution there in the middle of the 19th century. But if I understand you correctly, as a result of forces that were unleashed there, you saw a breakdown of that central bloc. If I understood you correctly, that you had mentioned it included Austria and Russia and one other element. Am I understanding that right?
Prussia, yes. Prussia, originally it included Prussia, France, and Britain. But France and Britain had long sort of betrayed, this the system of reaction. Britain intentionally, France, because France was never able to create a stable political situation since the fall of Napoleon. You can even argue today that France has still failed to create a stable political situation.
Yeah, which republic are they on now? Yeah,
they're on their fifth republic. So yes, and that's an important point. I'll bring up Nicholas I later, but just breaking down sort of individual countries during this period. Going back to Spain again, I mentioned the fact that Spain had a restoration, and then due to the ascension of Isabella, you had a division in Spain between the conservatives supporting Ferdinand's brother Carlos and his daughter Isabella, who under traditional Spanish Salic law could not inherit, and her own inheritance was used as a means for a liberal regency to really achieve power and transform Spain into a constitutional monarchy on the lines of Britain, again undermining the system of the more de Maistre-esque, conservative reaction. And this, leads Spain into a situation where it is governed by, various parliamentary cliques and eventually military cliques until the whole system breaks down in 1868, and you have a republic, an attempt by the Carlists to restore power, and then an Italian monarch, before then an Italian monarch. And then you have a second restoration in Spain, a second monarchical restoration after the Republic. And, in terms of, again, what is this restoration? This is a restoration of the already corrupted form of Spanish government under Isabella. It's so corrupt and useless that in addition to having all the same problems with military takeovers, such as Miguel de Primo de Rivera towards the end, the government operated on a basis of tonismo, which essentially meant that the political system was rigged so that the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party would be allotted times in power just to assuage the Spanish middle classes and to keep them contented with the system. So again, we start off with a reactionary restoration in Spain, the corruption into you can say, a constitutional bourgeois form of government, and then a restoration of that corrupt bourgeois form of government, and then that will collapse into a republic. So a lot of examples of this constant corruption. And when we see a restoration, it appears sort of weaker every time. And this happens in France at the same time. I mentioned Louis Philippe, and ironically that he was the incarnation of an earlier restoration, that of the awkward situation between 1789 and 1792. But there are two more restorations in short succession. There is the restoration of the Republic, albeit it's a far more conservative republic than, either of the early regimes, whether they be the National Convention or the Directory or the Consulate. And that falls apart because the man who wins the election to be president is one Louis Napoleon. And he, of course, is the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, the famous Napoleon Bonaparte. And using that prestige and power, he commits a self-coup and restores the Napoleonic Empire. But of course, the Napoleonic Empire doesn't really represent that much of a reactionary restoration either, because it still is based on these French revolutionary ideas. So under that regime, you have the fomenting and aiding of revolution in Italy, as I mentioned, with Cavour. And you have the further centralization of power and the aggressive expansion of social welfare schemes, the franchise, and the state in general, including law enforcement in particular. So it's a depressing trend with the 19th century that you ostensibly have a restoration, but it's coupled again with the gradual encroachment of the state and the socialization of the state, but also it's predicated on a system of power which was antithetical to the pre-French Revolutionary order. And again, this is just one element of restoration, which is in particular regime restoration, and by regime restoration I mean restoration in Europe. Another example sort of going forward, in terms of monarchical restoration, be, first of all, you have the Second Spanish Republic, you have the Spanish Civil War, and then you have the restoration, quote unquote, of a reactionary form of government under Franco. But when you have the real restoration, i.e. the restoration of Juan Carlos as King of Spain in 1975, like the previous restorations in Spain, that too foments more socialism and more democracy. I think the incredible thing about Franco's restoration is that it relied principally upon him. He wasn't able to produce an enduring system of power beyond his death. He had gone into the Civil War wanting to wipe out leftism forever. And, he prosecuted his, his political enemies as if, he was fighting a war. And within 7 years of his death, the socialists were back in power. So, everywhere we see these restorations, it just seems, to me, a temporary victory, despite the gargantuan efforts, made, among others by Metternich. there are always elements of subversion. And in case of Metternich, I believe it was a lack of power. Him in a position as Imperial Chancellor of Austria, not only did he not have control over the situation in Europe, not only was he having to deal with powers like France and Britain that were going rogue, but he himself had his own position within the empire checked by the emperor and by courtiers such as von Collivat. So yes, in terms of more examples of restoration, outside of Europe, one will lead me into talking about something which I think is actually really quite interesting and probably less depressing, which is Japan, which is the Kemu Restoration. Of course, this is like removing a military government and replacing it with an imperial form of government. And that will sort of lead into my next point, which is the inverse of this, unless you have any questions talking about that specific area of history first.
No, I would just say excellent, as always. I do want to just sort of, as they like to say, stick a flag in one thing, which is a point you've underscored here several times, but I want to make it very, very explicit in case anyone didn't catch it. And this is the fact that anticipation of waves of revolutionary change causes regimes and institutions to lean into that change, as they like to say these days, proactively. So I think the interesting point to draw from that is that, how shall I say this, perhaps far more effective than any of the actual, that all of this is far more effective than any of the actual instances of use of force. It's like torture. The threat of torture, we are told, is far more effective than its use. And it seems similarly that the threat of revolution is manifestly far more effective than any actual revolution. And here's what's very, very important, and far less costly for the revolutionaries. So take a look, for example, at the idea of these big corporations where they're afraid that they're going to have people, well, they affect fear. They pretend that they're fearful of this idea of people marching on their institution or their shops and breaking their windows, or them getting bad press on social media. So they all are essentially tripping over themselves to get up to the collection box and to drop huge checks into it for example, Black Lives Matter. And it seems to me that a lot of what you're talking about there with the governments, in anticipation, having seen what happened with 1848 and other instances, of course, the revolution in France before that, many of these governments said, well, naturally, we've got to incorporate such and such because these are liberal and progressive ideas, and, it represents progress to whatever extent, those terms had come online. It's their anticipation of what might be coming that causes them to compromise at the outset before any pressure is really applied. It so to speak, they get the most out of any instance of actual use of force and violence by hanging the threat of it over the heads of these different institutions and forcing them to accommodate themselves somewhat to it. And again, I hate to say it, but it does fit that idea of the Hegelian dialectical progression. And indeed, the dialectical progression is often worshipped by many of the sort of utopian or communist forces that push a lot of these changes, at least in the later phases of what we're talking about. So the last piece I want to throw in there is that this is not just a lesson about how they do things. I think it's also a very important lesson about what can be done by those who wish to answer these kind of movements. It would seem that the threat of revolution, used metaphorically in this sense, of course, no calls for violence here, could be just as effective coming from the other direction, if in fact, we can believe in the idea of neutral institutions. But we'll go ahead and set that question aside for the moment.
Well, thank you again for that summary, and again, a lot of interesting points to draw from. This moves on to my second definition of restoration. I've already mentioned a few more than that, obviously, but the second pertinent definition to this discussion, which is the idea of a restoration, which is really masquerading as a revolution. And by that, I mean it is, in theory at least, the restoration of a previous constitutional incarnation of a government, a monarchy in this case, with members of that same ruling family, however, with significant innovations in legal, administrative, and cultural areas. So one, just quick example of that before I get onto the main example I want to talk about is the Second Mexican Empire. This, coinciding with the fact that you had the rise of Napoleon, briefly after the collapse of Spanish rule in Mexico, you had the creation of a Mexican empire, which was basically just a military dictatorship, in all but name. And in 1863, during America's weakened position as a result of the Civil War going on at that time, and due to an attempt by France to exert, a much greater economic influence within the Americas, in contravention of things such as America's Monroe Doctrine, they invaded Mexico in 1863 and positioned a Habsburg, the younger brother of the Emperor of Austria, Franz Joseph Maximilian, as the Emperor of Mexico. Just to put this in a bit of a context, this is technically a restoration of a ruling family because it represents the restoration of Spain's, ancient dynasty before the Bourbons, and that would have been the Habsburgs, who were I won't get into this, but they lost power in Spain in 1701, and they restored in Mexico in 1863. Now, why wasn't this a reactionary restoration? Why was this a restoration revolution? Because like the department system in France, and as I mentioned, the French connection, the Napoleonic connection, Maximilian imposes a arbitrary, modernizing, European, centralizing form of government of Mexico. And just to give you a bit of backstory into Mexican history at that point, Mexico had a series of civil wars. And one of the driving reasons for those civil wars was the idea that Mexico should either be a confederacy or it should be a centralized unitary state. And this, again, was a desire to impose a form of centralizing administration, but also to radically redefine what the idea of Mexican is. And in this case, rather interestingly, Maximilian brought in, various liberal reforms, and he allowed for, basically not just immigration, but he allowed for, tax exemptions, for people who wanted to be immigrants, and, instantaneous citizenship for people who wanted to go to Mexico, in addition to, massively expanding the franchise, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So much so that he was, brought in by the clerical classes and the conservatives, and he ended up being, reviled by both factions, which, made it rather easy for Benito Juarez to take over and sadly execute him in 1867. Nevertheless, I think this is important to note that some restorations are not restorations, but they are basically masquerades as restorations, and that's sort of the lesson of the Second Mexican Empire. The inverse of that is the Meiji Restoration. I'm not sure how much your listeners are sort of familiar with Japanese history, but from the late 12th century until 1868, Japan, with the exception of the Kemei Restoration, had been ruled by a military elite, which I'm sure everyone is aware, the samurai. And at the head of this military elite, you have the generalissimo responsible for I think it's the evisceration of the northern barbarians, which is translated as shogun. And you had various incarnations of shogunates. So you had the Kamakura shogunate, you had the Ashikaga shogunate, and then you had the Tokugawa shogunate, where you still had an emperor during this time. But the emperor was basically a religious and ceremonial position, and all temporal authority was exercised by a shogun. And various times it wasn't even exercised by the shogun, but exercised by regional lords, powerful samurai known as daimyo, who would rule over certain domains. Or in the case of the Kamakura shogunate, it will be the regents of the shogun who would hold temporal authority. So Japan's political system is very complicated during this time. Nevertheless, Japan under the Tokugawa Bakufu shogunate, which lasts from 1600 until 1868, is very reactionary in the sense that after the period called Zengoku Jidai, where you had a massive influx of Western innovations. So you had the arrival of the Jesuits in Kyushu, and then expanding into central Japan. You had the introduction of Western firearms to Japan, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and the so-called Namban trade. And in response to this, Japan had closed the borders. I believe, I can't remember which shogun it is. I think it's Iemitsu, Tokugawa Iemitsu, decides to close the borders primarily to prevent these external foreign influences from changing the harmonious relationship of the shogun and his subjects. And this is, first of all, it's to contain, Western influence and Western involvement. He particularly fears the expansion of the Portuguese Empire into Japan. And he believes that Catholicism, Jesuit Catholicism in particular, is a means to undermine the social fabric, to foment an uprising which would aid in invasion. And so in response to this, for 250 years, more or less, the Tokugawa shogunate is able to control all access it has with the West through a tiny little port off the near Nagasaki, modern-day Nagasaki. And this arrangement, lasts for a very long time. And more or less, this is one of the most peaceful, stable periods in all of Japanese history. Not only that, despite it being a pre-industrial civilization, Japan is incredibly culturally rich during this time. There is a massive literary culture. And when I say, there isn't interaction with the West, well, there is, just on Japanese terms. So there is a great interest in European studies, through this conduit which the Dutch have at Nagasaki. And you have the massive expansion of the city of Edo, which would later become Tokyo. I believe in 1700, Edo has a population of somewhere near 1.5 million. So, one of the largest cities in the world in a pre-industrial civilization. And again, a city entirely made out of wood and existing on this, older social structure. And all of this has changed when one Commodore Perry arrives near Edo in, I think it's 1853, 1854, and gives the Japanese an ultimatum to open up the country or else. And just to give you a bit of context on that, the same thing had already happened in China. China had already fought and lost a war against the British, and it will fight and lose another war against the British in the First and the Second Opium Wars, imposing on China a system called the Unequal Treaties. And I believe the Japanese would have definitely been aware of this, given their conduit and access, and especially their special strategic interest in Korea and China at the time. They would have been aware of it, and they would have understood what the arrival of Commodore Perry represented. And it caused basically a complete breakdown in the law and order in the Bakufu. And this is when I talk about restoration, because this is really interesting yet really complicated. At the beginning of the Tokugawa shogunate, you had an event, an apocryphal event known as the Battle of Sekigahara, which created the new political situation. It was later cemented by the siege of Osaka. And the victors of that battle, the so-called Eastern faction, would forever be in a position to dominate and control the central government positions in Japan. And they would make up basically the Tokugawa faction, or the Tokugawa Bakufu. The losing factions in that battle, the Western factions, rather than being dispossessed and appropriated by the new regime, they were allowed their territories. And these domains in particular are the Satsuma domain, Chosu domain, and Toso domain. And this is, Chosu is in the western corner of Honshu, Satsuma is in southern Kyushu, and Tosa is in southern Shikoku. All of these provinces were allowed to exist during this time, and they had a dynastic continuity to the Battle of Sekigahara by the 19th century, but they were dispossessed from all positions of political power. And of course, you had the emperor, who still was around this entire time, even though he was only exercising, not temporal authority, but more or less spiritual authority. So you had a weakened regime, the Tokugawa Bakufu, having to deal with this threat of foreign invasion. And you already had a class of elites, elite samurai, who would have again supported any revolt that would have taken away this centuries-long imposition, which removed any sort of chance of political power within the state of Japan. So this creates, a perfect storm, which results in the Meiji Restoration, where the emperor is seen as the focal point for reform under a motto which will be adopted later, which is enrich the country, strengthen the military. The idea is we need to centralize, we need to unify the country, we need to bolster it behind the figurehead of the emperor in order to prevent us becoming subordinated to a foreign power, as China had done at the same time. And I think it's also important to note that China would try and do the same thing through its self-strengthening movement, but fail. So as you can see, this is a restoration in the purest sense, that this is a return to an older form of government. But then what happens after that, you have the old aristocracy, the samurai aristocracy taking over. You have the monarch, taking over. Again, this had been unheard of really since the 12th century. And yet all of the things from here are considered innovations in Japan. Say, for example, I already mentioned the domain system. You have the abolition of Japan's, very decentralized political structure, even under the Bakufu, and you had it being replaced by the modern structure of prefectures, where basically all of the daimyo donated their land to the centralized administration of the Japanese state. The samurai class in the West, who had been essential in allowing for the Meiji Restoration to take place and the deposition of the Tokugawa shogunate, then began to abolish all of the rights of the samurai and basically phased out the samurai as a warrior class, including confiscating their weapons. And this produces an interesting effect. On the one hand, you have this attempt to centralize the country under the administration of the emperor and prevent the samurai ever being in a position where they can restore the shogunate again. Again, you can say, like with the French Revolution, the restoration of the French Revolution, there is a necessity, imposed on this, which is the centralization of all power in this new administration, this supposedly reactionary administration, which is there to defend the state. But this produces a reaction of its own, which is fomented by one of the Meiji oligarchy, Saigo Takamori, in the Satsuma Rebellion, which, among other things, is a rebellion primarily for the rights of the samurai to continue their privileges, and also a generalized rebellion against the modernizing reforms of the Meiji government. So, a reaction within a reaction. And when I mean sort of modernizing, I mean it is an explicit attempt to impose Western-style names, institutions, clothing, industrialization, military innovations on Japan. So you begin with the Coronation Charter, which states the intention, to go out and learn explicitly, to set up embassies to go around and import ideas which will strengthen Japan. Yet at the same time, there is a desire to maintain the existing sort of political situation in Japan. And I have here a segment from Evola. Sorry, I'll just get it quickly. Which, sorry, I've been talking for a very long time, but
not at all. While you're getting that prepared, I would just throw in a sort of observation. I was pleased to see that you yourself were thinking along those lines already. But it is indeed an echo of that idea of the centralization of a revolutionary centralization top down requires a concomitant centralization in order to address it to some extent. I've seen people mention in the chat about mobilizing the population so that things aren't as transient as all that. But there's another point here, and you even kind of tapped on this a bit when you mentioned the business of military innovations, because the thing that immediately came to mind with the instance of Japan that you're considering here is the general idea of a existing regime being confronted with an alien military force that is superior. And this seems to quite consistently throughout history mandate the adoption of some of those military tactics. I mean, we could be here for hours if I were talking about how somebody got beat by one thing, and so they adopted it and used it when they came back against the other person, But just a few quick examples, there's the idea of horsemen, Xiongnu and the rest coming off the steppes and attacking the Chinese, so the Chinese introduced military reforms with trousers and, cavalry and this sort of thing. I know you're familiar with this as well, Mahmud II with the Tanzimat reforms, which are, social and political, but also the military reforms, getting rid of the Janissaries, getting rid of the Bektashi order, implementing all, adopting Western style military uniforms. And there's a really almost comical example of it with the Japanese, where, they managed to stave off the gunboat diplomacy, that you brought up sort of at the outset of this little segment. But in doing so, they adopted these matchlock rifles, which were entirely European. And then with this odd attempt to feel as though they were maintaining traditions, the Japanese are this one group that maintained matchlock rifles far beyond the time when they were ever in use in Europe. They've been swapped out with, flintlocks and, various weapons of this sort. So there's something there that's almost an echo of McLuhan's idea that the medium is the message. The structural elements necessary to support the creation and application of the military force, which go far beyond the domain of the military, rolling into things like social changes, organizational changes, structural, hierarchical changes, industrialization. All those things, despite the nominally reactionary nature of the exercise, they tend to bring about the very thing that you sort of were reacting to in the first place. And again, as horrific as this seems, it brings us back to this idea with dialectical progression of the negation of the negation.
Yes, and I think in terms of negation, I think the reason Japan is, I mean, you already mentioned the military innovation. The reason Japan is so significant a study for this is because, as with China being another example, when you adopt a reactionary traditionalist, feudalistic, whatever word you want to adopt, there is always the concern that with an absence of certain innovation, because again, such regimes do, censorious regimes in particular, do stifle innovation. You are always confronted with the idea of, technological superiority. And again, this is really just a question ultimately of power. In China, despite China's vast population, it was 400 million at this time, despite its vast borders, its vast internal empire at that time, the Qing dynasty was unable to defend against the relatively, in terms of numbers, insignificant forces of the British. And as a result, it, kickstarted a huge number of social problems and a total and utter societal disintegration, which would, ultimately lead to the situation we have now. In Japan, however, Evola believes that Japan is almost you can say the example where there is material benefit, and yet there is a spiritual or reactionary core to Japan. And again, the fact it is fundamentally a restoration as opposed to a revolution. And it is basing it around the, spiritual person of the emperor as the, central focal point of this administration, that there is something, inherently modern, but even the European elements of Japan are fundamentally external. And the Japanese element is still essentially, fundamental to the system. And I have here a couple of segments from Evola in which he talks about certain concepts. One is the Japanese concept of the emperor, whose mandate is arrived directly from heaven, and that this concept was very much alive in Japan with the certain ritual of the enthronement of the Japanese emperor, which again takes place in this specific individual spiritual context where the emperor is, establishes, the order of the universe and the son of heaven. Because again, the Japanese emperor, the Tenno, is very much, originally based on the more or less the Tang dynasty position of emperor, even though the Japanese claim that their own office of emperor, begins with Jimmu, which precedes that of Qin Huangdi. Nevertheless, this goes on. Its traditional national form, Shintoism, exemplifies an influence that rectified and raised to a higher level a cultural milieu that partially derived from a primitive stratum. In historical times, at the heart of Shintoism, we find the imperial idea and the identification of the imperial tradition with the divine tradition. Obeying a command, I have descended from heaven. It says in the Kogiki about the founding father of the Japanese imperial dynasty. In a commentary by Prince Hakabon Itoi, it said, "The sacred throne was created when earth became separated from heaven, that is, at the time of the dissolution of the primordial unity of the earthly and the divine realities, an echo which is also found in the Chinese tradition. Thus, quite often the ideograms representing nature and heaven are synonymous. The emperor descends from heaven. He is divine and sacred. To the emperor, who is also attributed a solar principle, though with a confusing transposition of the feminine principle, his descendants came from goddess Amaritsu, Omikami. On the basis, the act of governing and of dominating formed one thing with the cult. The term Matsurigoto signifies both government and pursuit of religious affairs. In the context of Shintoism, loyalty, unwavering faithfulness to the ruler, assumed a religious meaning and was at the basis of its ethics. Any reprehensible, low, or criminal deed was not thought of as a transgression, but an abstract social law, but rather as a betrayal, an act of disloyalty, and a disgrace. There were no guilty people in Japan. Rather, there were traitors or people without honor. These general values received a particular emphasis in the warrior nobility, bushi or samurai, in its ethics, bushido. The orientation of tradition in Japan was essentially active and even militaristic, but its counterpart consisted of an inner formation. The samurai's ethics had a warrior and ascetical character, and also a sacred and ritual features. It remarkably resembles the elements typical of the feudal and knightly European Middle Ages. Besides Shintoism, Zen, which is an esoteric form of Buddhism, played a role in the formation of the samurai, and also in the traditional formation of various aspects and customs of Japanese life, including the arts and crafts, the presence of sex, and the practice Buddhism in its most recent weakened and religious forms, such as Amidism, have not substantially modified the predominant character of the Japanese spirit. In Japan, together with Bushido, we find the traditional idea of the warrior's sacrificial death, exemplified by kamikaze, the suicide pilots of World War II. Until recently, Japan has offered an example, unique in its kind, of the coexistence of traditional orientation with the adoption on a material plane of the structures of modern technological society. In the aftermath of World War II, a millenary continuity was shattered and an equilibrium lost. So yes, just sort of again in summary with this point, I do believe there's some element of truth in that. I believe the ultimate irony is that Japan embarks on this enrich the country, strengthen the military, loyalty to the emperor. And it does so by superficially, externally adopting Western elements. And just to provide a little bit more context on that, it restructures its nobility. So they can have allusions to Western nobility. So the system is simplified, and there is prince of this and duke of that, etc. A Western style diet or parliament is established for the Japanese. In addition, for, again, as I mentioned, the centralized form of administration, importing ships from Britain, and as Semigog already mentioned, the importation of matchlocks. And yet, at the same time, Japan is obsessed with this idea of national independence, created out of the situation from Commodore Perry. And so rather than just staying in Japan, rather than just defending Japan, Japan becomes increasingly materialistic and seeks to carve out its own sphere of influence at the expense of the West. And in this sense, it becomes a traditional Western great power. The irony being that as Japanese would become more expansionist, nominally to defend, the quintessence of being Japanese, it would eventually, become embroiled in the war with America, the Second World War, which would result in what you can say is almost the total destruction of every sort of element which Evola is alluding to there.
Yeah, it's rather amusing when anyone who's been to Japan or even looked into it, more than superficially, when you hear people talk about Japan and they've maintained their culture and their identity and everything, nothing could be further from the truth. When I was visiting, I was like, well, what about religion and all the rest? And everyone, the Japanese people I spoke with, they're like, well, that's sort of a superficial, social observance that has very little in the way of actual religious significance at this point. Or you're walking on the streets and you'll see a Japanese Christian kind of doing the sort of Christian street preacher routine, like out in public. I mean, the way in which they've the way in which the country has been utterly shattered and rebuilt, from this process, and the way in which you can see how it starts way back, with the sort of gunboat diplomacy stuff. You can see the process has been going on for quite some time. And there's a thing my friend Tim used to always talk to me about. He'd talk about, hold the object up and see what it is. And, when he mentioned things like that, he'd hold up a pack of cigarettes or a can of Coca-Cola or something. And when we think about having that object, or a matchlock, or a tank, military technology, whatever, there's a whole superstructure or a whole set of related elements that are necessary to bring that thing into being. And so to a certain extent, all you have to do is convince a people that they need a can of Coke. And once that is accepted, all the other elements, all the things that, go into to producing those things in volume, the infrastructure, everything, they have to come into existence to make it possible. And so, again, I think we see another little interesting point that can be abstracted out of this, which is, get them to take any of it and through a sort of an intellectual process of action and reaction, they're going to end up at a similar place. I mean, the whole point of this was, or I guess the launching point of this sort of historical excursus was their attempt to limit the access and keep it at bay. And we could see similar things with, ports on the coast of China. And yet, look at where it all arrived.
Exactly. And I think this is, again, something fundamental to talk about. I mean, you mentioned the superficiality, post-war especially, of the Japanese spirit, for lack of a better word. I think this is almost demonstrated by their new constitution. The emperor ceases to be, descended from Amoritsu. He ceases to be the divine head of state, which all, object and loyalty is devoted to, the personification of Nippon, of Japan. But he has simply become the symbol of state, essentially.
A citizen monarch.
Yes, basically, and this is all the same. This is Hirohito, posthumous, his posthumous regnal name is Showa. So yes, it's rather depressing, but it's the hollowing out, and again, this, as Evola talks about, Japan was remarkably able to hold at bay you could almost say the corrupting effects of materialization, but as we can see, the materialization of Japan is almost, completely in the ascendant compared to a very superficial spiritual aspect. If it's all right, because I'm conscious of time, that sort of completes my talk about the Restoration Revolution, and I move on to the internal revolution, or the internal restoration rather. And this is just an example. This is when you have a previous, cultural constitutional incarnation within a pre-existing system. And rather than having a new system to bring about that restoration is conducted from above. It is conducted internally. And, periodically, this would be, a monarch deciding to, want to revert to an older state of affairs, even though this isn't always exclusively the case, as I'm about to show. One of the most famous examples of this, of course, is Julian the Apostate, who would attempt to bring Rome back to paganism. and localize and parochialize Christianity by making it an extension of the Jewish religion, and therefore reject its claims to, universal rulership, and instead position the emperor as, Pontifex Maximus, as the, arch bridge builder, as the central religious figure of all life within the empire. And in addition to just restoring paganism, it's also important to note that he also wanted to restore a more republican form of government. And by that, for any sort of Roman sort of legal scholars out there, the differentiation between the principate, or the first citizen, versus the dominate, i.e. the master and god, which had been advocated by his predecessor Diocletian. And when I mean, the restoration of paganism, paganism isn't uniform by any means. He attempts to create his own variation of paganism which orientates around his own Neoplatonic education among the god Helios. And this, was at odds not just with Christianity, but within previous incarnations of paganism. Say, for example, one of the last great pagan emperors was Aurelian, and Aurelian had created a monotheistic cult to Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, the god of soldiers. So that's sort of one interesting example. And again, he almost, you could say, succeeded. The thing that prevented this more than anything was his lack of an heir due to his ascetic lifestyle, even though some people suggest he was gay. But his reign was cut down prematurely when he fell during a campaign against the Persians. Again, a military victory against the Persians could have, massively cemented his rule.
Much like Caesar, yes, this sad thing of going off to fight, Persians and Parthians. They don't always get to do it. We would have crushed the East much sooner. Yes, and Julian also probably had problems with girlfriends, not wanting to ever trim his beard. And as I recall, he was not into clipping his nails either.
Oh no, he was very monk-like in that way. No, a lot of mortification of the flesh going on, trying to live as but basically your traditional Greek monk. So moving on from that, there is the case of Sulla, another Roman example. And this is an example of a republic trying to restore an early incarnation of itself. Prior to Sulla, you'd had a complete redefinition of what Rome was. Rome had originally been this conception of the citizen militia soldier, defending the republic, since the deposition of the last king Tarquinius.
Talking about like the Marian Reforms?
Yes, the Marian Reforms are sort of what, fundamentally changed Roman society and massively expand the army, and, removes the centrality of this concept of the citizen soldier. And this is where we have Sulla. Sulla was, great enemies with Gaius Marius, and he would lead two marches on Rome as leader of the faction aligning itself with the Senate, known as the Optimates. And in addition, the idea of the Populares, which was the Marian faction, was this association with demagogy and with riling up the plebs against the traditional patrician elite. And this, of course, is going to be exploited and achieved under Caesar, and then finalized under Augustus. The complete removal of the Senate as any sort of relevant body other than the purely constitutional sense. However, Sulla comes in, and in his second march on Rome, he issues the Sullan prescriptions, involving basically the massacre of all of his political enemies, again, to prevent the Populares ever posing a serious threat to the senatorial order. And he imposes a new system of Roman law, basically restoring much of the old privileges, senatorial privileges, that had been lost in the preceding decades due to the rise of the military faction. However, again, there's always a caveat with these restorations. This regime would only succeed if the Senate was powerful enough to maintain their privileges in their own right. And of course, Sulla does this through military means. He is a great general, having fought in the Mithridatic Wars in modern-day Turkey. And he comes back, and it is through his own military position that he's able to maintain this restoration of an older incarnation of the Republic. And
he also suspended a number of, didn't he do something with the tribunate of the plebs?
Yes, he seriously limited its powers as well, because of course Rome had a form, for lack of a better word, separation of powers, where you had the tribunals of the plebs, and you had the Senate factions as well. So yes, it was very much a empowering of the Senate faction at the expense of the plebeian factions in Rome. Nevertheless, as I mentioned, this relied on the continued presence of loyal troops to Sulla, not to the Senate, to Sulla, maintaining a presence, throughout Italia. So when he dies, this is in 82 BC. When he dies in 79 BC, this system, is fundamentally exposed, because it relies on a military strongman. And due to the Marian Reforms, the irony is you have created a situation where generals are able to offer more, again, gibs and loyalty to their, receive more loyalty to their troops than the Senate. And so, as we're going to see later with Caesar crossing the Rubicon, once you establish the means of, enforcing constitutional reforms from military power, your opposition can do it against you as well. And this is exactly what Caesar does. So again, I talk about the centrality of power and this irony that you can say these more centralizing reforms allow for an increase in power, yet that also undermines fundamentally your position as well. I think we see that with Sulla. Even though, again, that's an oversimplification of Sulla's, the complex Roman politics of the 1st century BC, just for the sake of this conversation. Moving on sort of chronologically from that, we have, I would say, religious restoration. And this is the example of England, England's own attempted restoration to bring back the Catholic Church. And there are 2 attempts at this, and again, I just want to show a broad example of spectrum of ideas. I don't want to just locate this in the post-French Revolution, mode exactly. So we have the Reformation in 1517. Henry VIII establishes the Church of England. His son, Edward VI, continues that Reformation under the guidance of Thomas Cranmer, and he dies prematurely. I believe he's 15 in 1853, and he's replaced by his Catholic sister, who becomes Queen Mary. Now, Queen Mary, after having basically decided that she was going to restore the Mass, going to restore the Catholic Church, remove the Church of England and her own supremacy, and give that power back to the Pope, that she was going to rely on foreign power to back this up. So she formed an alliance with Spain, which causes a huge reaction among the English nobles, among Thomas Wyatt and the Wyatt Rebellion, and this is put down brutally. And she basically believes that with time and with this alliance, through the procreation of an heir, England can revert back to Catholicism. Of course, she is rather old at this point; she's nearly 40. And Philip has no interest in bedding her. He's spending most of his time in Spain. And so in her desperation, I think it's quite tragic, she has a series of phantom pregnancies. And again, when this fails, and when it's pretty obvious that she's not going to produce an heir, and when she herself, her health is failing, she begins to take extreme measures to try and impose this restoration, this reaction against the Protestant Reformation, by creating the Protestant martyrs, by burning several hundred Protestants at the stake, basically believing that by removing the leaders of the Reformation, you would create a situation where intellectually Protestantism couldn't make a revival, and that she would present her legal successor, Elizabeth, with a fait accompli. And just to put this in context, Julian tried to do the same thing. He tried to prevent the Christians from being educated in his long-term strategy of depriving the Christians of elites. In the same way, Mary was also trying to deprive the Protestant Reformation of elites as well, even though I think this is quite a forlorn task, considering how Europeanized intellectualism was at that point. All it would have taken was a few exiles in Germany to return, and the whole thing would have started again, and indeed it did. She died in 1858, and England, passed rather easily back to the supremacy of the Church of England. And there were various attempts to restore Catholicism, ostensibly also under Mary Queen of Scots during the Babington Plot, and more forcefully again externally through the Spanish Armada of 1588. But as we probably all know, all of these things obviously failed. So
and do we see perhaps a reflection of that attempt to wipe out the offending and opposing elites with the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre as well?
Yes, this is in France at the same time. This again is directed towards the Protestants. The reason I don't necessarily include this within a restoration is because France never had an explicitly Protestant monarch. The only Protestant monarch they had was Henry IV, who abjured his faith in order to be crowned. So that's why I haven't included France in this list of restorations, even though a very similar attempt to crush the Huguenots, in this case, the reformed branch of the church in France, was happening across the Channel. And it did play a large role in anti-Catholic fervor in England at this time, because these events are contemporaneous.
So we could see at least that it would seem reasonable to draw the conclusion that a short-term attempt to wipe out the elites, well, perhaps historically they were, to wipe out the opposing elites, perhaps historically they were never quite thorough enough, but it would seem that they're contraindicated, that they don't work well, or haven't thus far.
Yes, and again, this is also something that happened with Sulla as well, with the prescriptions. It just occurs to me when I was, that didn't even occur to me when I was writing these examples, but yes, all of these attempts so far have involved a desire to, or a serious attempt to remove the potential of the opposition to create elites, whether they be Christian elites, whether they be the Popularis faction, whether they be Protestant elites. All of these renditions of this internal restoration have involved the same sort of purge.
Real prescription has never been tried.
So moving on to something which is slightly different, slightly more subtle, which is the attempted Re-Catholicization under James II. Again, if anyone is interested, I've done a video on Julian the Apostate and on James II on my channel, just to give you a bit more historical context on this. Sadly, I can't make it that concise, but when it comes to James II, James II is, as I mentioned with the case of Louis XVIII and Charles X, you have a initial Stewart Restoration, and then you have a even greater restoration followed by the succeeding monarch. With the case of Louis XVIII, there was a weak, wet constitutional arrangement that attempted to placate all parties. In Charles X, it was an attempt to really restore, for lack of a better word, the derisive term Ancien Regime. With Charles I, you have the restoration of the monarch. With James II, Charles II, you have the restoration of the monarch. With James II, you have not only the restoration of the monarch, but also potentially the restoration of Catholicism. During the preceding times, there had been prescriptions against Catholics even entering into military service or entering into the bureaucracy, and this was actually imposed by his brother. So much so that James had to relinquish his role as Lord High Admiral because of his open Catholicism now at this point. However, when he becomes king, his brother had become sort of much more staunchly conservative and high Anglican, and eventually he would convert to Catholicism on his deathbed. And so he wanted the ascension of his brother James. At the same time, there was a political faction which supported the absolute divine right of kings, which was the original Tories before they become hopelessly corrupted into the version we have today. However, the weakness that sort of James II inherits from this is the fact that the Tories are not only they absolute defenders of divine right of kings, but they are also defenders of the established church. And James II uses this to try and effect a compromise by which he doesn't do what Bloody Mary does. Queen Mary, of course, again, I'm sure people who are devout Catholics will find that offensive, but nevertheless, she did try and wipe out the Protestant opposition. And I do confess that, as a Catholic, I probably shouldn't have used that term. But when it comes to James II, he tries to use that position as supreme head of the Church of England to undermine it. And he does this by trying to compel the bishops and clergymen throughout his kingdom to read out a declaration of indulgence that would have granted religious conscience, religious rights and participation in the state for Catholics. And, that seems like a rather modest compromise in the grand scheme of things. But this actually produces quite a strong reaction from within the Anglican clergy. And rather than treating with them, James II basically believes he is the supreme governor of the Church of England. They are his servants, even though he's a Catholic, and it's pretty obvious from their point of view that he's wanting to undermine their privileged position. So they refuse to do this, and James II commits the tactical error of sending them to the Tower of London, which basically makes them, again, a form of martyr, even though not a explicit martyr in the sense that he killed them. And I think one of the most depressing things about James II was this, despite his incredible military career, was his ability to alienate his closest supporters. So he begins his reign by winning, the last sort of victory, battle on British soil against the Duke of Monmouth, the bastard son of his brother. And yet by 1688, the last year of his reign, all of his great best soldiers, including the Duke of Marlborough, the scion of the Churchill family, go over to the opposition, because across the Channel, in the Netherlands, there is William the Stadtholder of the Netherlands, who is not only related to James, but he's also the husband of James's daughter by an earlier marriage, who is a Protestant. So there is already an alternative government waiting, and you have this act of treason from not only Whigs but also Tories who believe in the Church of England, called the Immortals, who basically invite the Dutch under William and Mary to invade England to restore parliamentary rule over the king and to restore the traditional faith. And this is where we have the Glorious Revolution. So as you can see, even with a much more modest attempt, and you can say covert attempt, to bring back Catholicism by utilizing the power of supreme governor, that failed completely in the form of James II. And when he essentially had a mental breakdown in 1688 as a result of all these betrayals and fled, he would later come back and try and fight against William in Ireland, and he would lose, and this would be the Battle of the Boyne, and this would also be a defining moment in Northern Irish nationalism at the same time. So in terms of sort of what to draw from that, again, it's quite depressing. It's a matter that even when you find someone who is reactionary within that position, who is trying to covertly again influence things towards a more reactionary course, that produced such a strong reaction. And again, it comes to the centrality of power within all this. You had James being the undisputed king, the completely undisputed king, with no opposition. He potentially could have re-Catholicized the nation, because it would have had to result in another civil war and a creation of another commonwealth and the execution of another king. So the irony was that it was actually the birth of a son, the Stewart claimant of James III, that ensured his demise, because people were terrified about the idea of a Catholic dynasty when they had this opposition dynasty across in the Netherlands who would essentially acquiesce to the Whigs. So a lot going on there.
Indeed. Yes, that would seem to require, to properly dig into that would seem to require an excursus into the nature of the sort of non-government powers, economic powers, and the balance you have to strike with that, the rule of fives, that sort of thing. But it as you say, it's certainly not encouraging. In fact, most of these examples thus far, perhaps we'll get to this at the end, but they don't seem to be particularly encouraging.
That's a nice time to come to a more encouraging example then, which is the example of Nicholas. To give you a background in Russian history, Russia has this perplexing position in that it's not really a European power, but it's not really an Asiatic power at the same time. In terms of how I identify it, I situate it firmly in the what I would consider to be the Byzantine Commonwealth, whereby you have traditional Orthodoxy versus traditional Catholicism, and Protestantism is a conflict within the old Catholic world, and you can say a revolt against that, but it's still part of the same world. The Russians under Peter the Great, who was one of the most famous of all the Tsars, attempted a series of external reforms like that in Japan, but you can argue that they were even more radical in the sense that Peter had no intention on being true to the Byzantine notion of his office of basically the successor of the Byzantine emperors and the protector of the Third Rome, so much so that he wanted just to subordinate the Orthodox Church to the secular position of the Tsar, to create a window on the West in St. Petersburg that would imitate Western customs, that would be a source of Western materialization and trade, that would be a source of Western science, etc., etc., etc. And this is a process that continues throughout the Age of Women, throughout Anna, throughout Elizabeth, his daughter, and throughout Catherine the Great's reign as well. And so after Alexander, the Tsar who defeats Napoleon, who himself is a rather ambiguous character, and you can say that the reaction really starts with his own religious conversion after 1812, his own reaction against Napoleon. This is really cemented in the form of Nicholas, who adopts a Slavophile interpretation of what it means to be Russian, that Russia is no longer European, that we are going to reject this westernizing, secularizing, scientific influence of the West, and we are going to adopt orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. We are going to advocate for the unity of the Russian people. We are going to advocate for the traditional hierarchy and the structure of the Orthodox Church, and all under the aegis of a all-powerful Tsar ruling autocratically, in the style not of Peter the Great, even though he certainly was an autocrat, but more in the style of Ivan the Terrible, who was the original Tsar.
Old school, as it were.
Yes, exactly. And even within the system, there is you can say there is reform and innovation in the reign of Alexander II, who emancipates the serfs and ends the feudal age of Russia.
But as I recall, he got a bomb under his carriage as thank you.
Yes, exactly. The irony being that the more liberal again you're just creating more forces that are never sated. There were 7 assassination attempts against him. That was just the successful one. Ironically, just as he was about to implement more liberal reforms before abdicating and going to live in Nice in exile. So he is replaced by his son, Alexander III. And Alexander III issues a manifesto on unshakable autocracy. So this is, a conscious rejection, again, of the attempts to liberalize and weaken the autocracy. He limits the powers of the various provincial parliaments, the Zemstvo, and he, again, tries to reinforce this idea of a uniform Russified identity throughout all of Russia, again, based on the Orthodox Church. And I think it's also important to note that Alexander II himself was part of this tradition when it came to Russification, in terms of, suppressing all the various local languages, whether even Ukrainian, for example, through the use of, various edicts such as the Ukaz. So really, when you had the reign of Nicholas II, you had a conscious intellectual environment in Russia, which was supported by, among others, Dostoevsky. It was supported by, intellectually, it was supported by the Five. To some extent, Leo Tolstoy, even though he was, again, politically, is quite interesting to talk about, but there was a great sympathy at this time for Russian autocracy and this desire to detach Russia away from the West. And you can say in that sense that it wasn't just a political victory for this form of government, because as we mentioned, one thing we also need to consider is industrialization. It is the ability of Russia to defend itself, which was the issue that Nicholas wasn't able to deal with because he was defeated in the Crimean War. But Alexander III is able to create an environment for Western investment and expansion of the railways in particular, which allow for Russia to capitalize on its dominant position when it comes to resources and really invest in the territory of Russia and expand its armed forces, but also keeping the peace in Europe as well, because fundamentally peace is advantageous to creating this harmonious order within the situation of Russia as well. And my personal view, I'm going to be doing streams on this later, is that this situation could have continued had it not been for a series of unforced errors and blunders committed by his successor, Nicholas II. But so yes, I do believe in Russia you almost have an example of a definitive reaction and a successful reaction that was overcome not due to intellectual or ideological blunders, but due to, you can say, almost incompetences in the actual administration, as opposed to any ideological weakness.
And that's an interesting point. This is just sort of like a parenthetical or an aside, but I'm familiar with Russian history that for quite some time they had sort of wanted to be accepted sort of into the community of Europe. And, you have, of course, the adoption of French at the court. You have Catherine the Great trying to support her pet intellectuals like Voltaire. There are a lot of German families that get brought into the Russian royalty. There's this attempt to sort of prove that they're a part of it as well. And, they're getting involved in many things in the 18th century in terms of the politics of various nations, and in the early 19th century. But I hadn't really thought about it, but I suppose that point at which the Russians began to say, we're our own thing, to hell with all of you, am I correct in assuming that's marked by that point at which you have Nicholas I sort of stepping back, perhaps in part because of the business of the stuff with the Crimean War, in which he watched the Christian nations ally with the Ottomans, but also wasn't there a French king who pissed him off? Was he also that citizen monarch?
Not quite. Nicholas I institutes this, rather early in his reign. To my mind, it is a reaction to. You mentioned Louis. I think you were intimating Louis Philippe. Yes, he was horrified by the ascension of Louis Philippe. He was also horrified by the Polish uprising in November of the same year, 1830. And I believe the formulation of this stratagem, orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality, arrives just a couple of years later. And this is after Russia has achieved a dominant military position in the Caucasian and in the Turkish wars, establishing much of the modern boundaries, say, of Turkey and Iran today. So yes, I do believe there is this interesting notion that once Russia is in this strong position, having been, as you say, desperate, especially under the reign of Peter the Great, to establish Russia externally to other European powers as a acceptable member of the club, as a great power in their mold. Once Russia had achieved superpower status in the early 19th century, they reversed that position. And they adopted a more, again, a haughty, position of disdain, not just, for the politics, but also for the intellectualism of the West. Because, again, many of the Russian aristocrats and Russian soldiers, Russian officers at this time, had been influenced by the ideas of the French Revolution and brought it back to them. And at the beginning of the reign of Nicholas I, we have the Decembris Rebellion by said officers. In terms of the weakening position at the Crimean War, yes, that does instigate a form of liberalizing reforms, because Nicholas dies during the Crimean War. He dies in 1855, and Alexander II comes in, obviously the same year. However, once the Russian position had been rectified after the Crimean War, after the temporary setback, the military setback, once the emancipation had taken place, and once the liberal reforms had taken place, then you have this eruption of revolutionary activity. But you also have the restoration of Russia's position on the world stage, because the end of Alexander's reign, the second's reign, coincides with the victory in the Turkish War, which again achieves what Nicholas failed to achieve, which is the massive expansion of Russian influence in the Balkans, even though it's limited by the Congress of Berlin. And the result of his own assassination and death, you have the return to unshakable autocracy. So yes, I do believe, again, like Japan and China, other examples, there is always this trade-off between reactionary policies and external security.
Very good, very good. I'm sorry to throw that in there. I was just curious about it. I realize I've derailed you to some extent, but you, as usual, improvise beautifully. Go on, sir.
So I think in terms of, there's really sort of one last thing I want to talk about, and really a question at the end, because I won't have enough time to go into it, which is the final form of the penultimate form of restoration I have for you this evening, after that discussion on internal restoration, which is this idea of state restoration. Now, compared to what I mentioned, independence, in my view, assumes that you have a continuity of a people and the idea of a state. So, for example, Finland has a cohesive territory. It has, a dominant ethnicity, and its borders, before it became independent, its borders were defined by the occupying administration of Russia. So independence from that point of view is quite simple. What I'm talking about with state restoration is this recreation of a state which had ceased to exist in many cases, hundreds of years ago. So the examples I have here to talk about are much older examples, but nevertheless, with the restoration of these states, it's not just the restoration of a nation, but it's also the restoration of what that nation represents, that identity and those ideas. And this is all pre-French Revolution. So probably the greatest, the earliest example I have is Sui China. China, of course, was unified in 222 BC, I think, by Qin Huangdi, literally means the first celestial ruler of the Qin. And his dynasty collapses very soon after, and it is the Han dynasty, probably China's greatest dynasty, which takes over and creates, the modern, really begins the state of China, and it lasts for about 400 years, from 200 BC until 200 AD. Then, at the end of that period, you have a general sort of political disintegration. First of all, you have a very famous period within Chinese history. You have the creation of the Three Kingdoms, and several dynasties crop up. At one point, there are 16 kingdoms within China. And then eventually it sort of coalesces into a southern dynasty and a northern dynasty. The reason I represent Sui dynasty China, which comes about in 581, is because this comes after 370 years of China ceasing to exist as a united territorial entity. If anything, the best comparison would be, had Justinian being able to restore the entire Roman Empire, essentially, is what the Sui are able to achieve. So it's this restoration of again, like an ancient form of administration, this idea of Han China. And this idea continues, and it continues to this day, and we have much expanded borders. In terms of, again, more sort of specific ideas, another example you're probably well aware of, Semigog, is the Byzantine Restoration. In 1204, Byzantium is, of course, Constantinople is, of course, sacked by the forces of the Fourth Crusade and the Venetians. And in response to this, you have the creation of the so-called Francocratia, which in Greek just means rule of the Franks. They destroy really, I mean, it's incredible. They destroy the 1,700-year continuity of the institutions of the Roman Republic, because, of course, they had existed throughout the Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire, for lack of a better word, as well. And remnants of those various families within Constantinople would establish successor states in Anatolia. The Lascaris family would establish themselves in, I think it's Nicaea.
And there was one up there in like near Trabzon as well, right?
Yes, those are the Komnenoi. Would establish themselves as the emperors of Trebizond, and they would also control parts of the Crimea as well. And you would also have, I believe, a family operating in the Despotate of Epirus as well. But for the most part, all of the other territories were either under, Venetian control, Venetian influence, or were held by Western duchies. The biggest one, of course, being Baldwin of Flanders, who creates basically is installed as Latin emperor. And what that basically means is the Latin prince who controls the city of Constantinople, who by virtue of that is given the dignity of emperor, even though within the Catholic tradition there is a Holy Roman Emperor at this point. And again, nominally the temporal ruler of all Christendom in competition with the Pope. And that breaks the sort of ancient continuity of Byzantium. But nevertheless, this system is incredibly unstable. Not to mention the Greeks are relatively hostile, and surprisingly few members of the original Greek aristocracy support it. As I mentioned, there was already an exodus to these various successor states, and there aren't enough Frank colonists. And when I mean Frank, of course, I'm really referring to Western European, because that was how the Byzantines viewed Western Europeans. Basically, Frank could almost be synonymous with Latin. And Latin, of course, being a reference to the Latin Rite as opposed to the Greek Rite in terms of religion. So this system only lasts 55 years and it collapses. And due to a coup, the Palaeologus dynasty is able to restore their position as rulers of Byzantium. But again, when talking about restoration, it is the restoration of this old idea, which is the continuity of the Eastern Roman Empire. Nevertheless, most of the legal institutions, including that of the Senate, are basically gone definitively at that point. And you can say the Byzantine Empire is far more sort of traditionally monarchical and despotic under the Palaeologus than it is under the traditional structures of the Roman Empire. More or less also in terms of talking about the other forms of restoration, which are territorial restoration, it is much weaker, and it is unable to evict the Venetians, and it is unable to evict a new power arising in Bithynia at this time, which are the Ottoman Turks. And so this state is a failed restoration in the sense it never is able to achieve the dominant position of its predecessor, the Byzantine Empire under, I believe it's the Angeloi dynasty. But nevertheless, it's kind of like a last cry before the final end of Byzantium in 1453. And coincidentally, this Palaeologus dynasty also fails to even bring the successor states under its control. So Trebizond would remain independent during this time, having its own emperor, and they would actually be deposed by Mehmed the Conqueror after the deposition of Constantine XI in 1461. And again, in terms of sort of other restorations, I think this sort of follows on nicely. There's also in Italy, at the same time, you have an attempt by Cola di Rienzo to restore the Roman Republic, and by evicting the popes. And this, of course, is taking advantage of the various instability as a result of the Western Schism during this time. And he almost succeeds. At one point, he's recognized by both kings of Hungary and kings of Naples as the tribune of the Republic, and he demands oath of loyalty from the Holy Roman Emperor to recognize Rome as the caput mundi, the capital of the world. Trying to again restore the hegemony of Rome. Through his position of it as a Republican tribune. But of course, he does this twice, and he's evicted both times. But again, that's like just an interesting example, I thought, in terms of trying to revive this idea of an ancient state. In this case, it's the idea of the Roman res publica. And in terms of my sort of final examples on this topic, I want to take you to Iran, because Iran is an interesting example. The Sasanian Empire had been you can almost say the continuity of the Achaemenid Empire in many senses, which itself had a breach. Itself was conquered by the Greeks, and there was the Seleucid Empire, which ruled most of the Persian provinces at that time. And there was a sort of restoration under the Parthians, even though the Parthians weren't ethnically Persians. And then there was a full restoration under the House of Sasan during the middle of the 3rd century. And this, the Sasanian Empire, represented the last great Zoroastrian empire, encompassing a vast territory, much larger than modern-day Iran, including, most of modern-day Iraq, the Caucasus, Oman, parts of Yemen, most of the Persian Gulf, Afghanistan, Baluchistan, expanding up until India, Turkmenistan, etc. And this system, of course, is brought to an end due to, well, fundamentally 2 external factors. One was the brutal war with Heraclius, and the second one being the Islamic invasions, which again, the Islamic invasions are really made possible by this brutal war between Khosrau II and Heraclius. And with this, you have the destruction of a system of power, a state within Iran, and its conquest, and you can almost say assimilation by the Muslims, because this isn't just a political conquest, but this is a spiritual conquest of Iran at the same time. Zoroastrianism isn't wiped out, but it becomes virtually insignificant during this period. There are locations, I believe, within Iran, like Yazd, where there was a concentration of Zoroastrian worship, but due to the Muslim way of administrating under Sharia, by which certain peoples of the book, had the jizya imposed on them, there were natural incentives for elites to convert to the Arab religion, Mohammedanism or Islam, and they did, and it fundamentally sort of transformed Iran forever. So the example I have, the last example in terms of this, and again, this pertains back to sort of reactionary restoration, is Safavid Iran. Because when you get to Safavid Iran, it's nearly 1,000 years after the destruction of a traditional idea of a continuity of domestic Persian states. Just to put this in context, the Persians have been first dominated by Arabs. And then, as a result of the Turkification of the military forces of the Abbasid Caliphate, you would have a series of Turkified dynasties in Persia as well. And the most famous of these probably being the Seljuk Turks ruling over Iran from the city of Rey, and eventually the Khwarezmian Empire ruling from Khorasan, which again is my geography of Central Asia isn't that good, and then after that, to make things worse, you have the Mongolian invasions, which level the entire Khwarezmian Empire and destroy vast population sectors within Iran. And this is later even reinforced when the Ilkhanate is destroyed, which is the Mongolian government there. You have the conquest of Tamerlane, which, ironically, is a restoration of the Mongol government using the pretext that he's married into the Genghis dynasty. And so you have another desolation of the destruction of the Iranian settlements. And so finally in the 15th century, of all places, you have Ismail Safavid, who comes from an obscure Sufi order in Ardabil in northeastern Iran, which really ethnically consist of Azerbaijanis, and they were supported by a group of Turks known as the Kizilbash, Turkomans known as the Kizilbash, or the red-headed ones, I think.
Redheads.
Yes, and this ragtag coalition is able to occupy Tabriz in 1500, and from that position proclaim the expansive state of Iran. Now, again, this is sort of bizarre. You've had nearly 1,000 years of foreign occupation. You've had the Islamicization, the Muslimification of the Iranian Empire. Zoroastrianism had been pushed aside. Then, in terms of his own ethnicity, Ismail, I believe, was part of this order, but he also had, I think, links to the Turkomans, and he also had links to the Empire of Trebizond, which we mentioned, one of the last holdovers of the Byzantine Empire. And why this is so significant and why I bring this up is because from this point, we have the Turks taking over most of the rest of the Muslim world under the aegis of Sunni Islam, and Selim the Grim will take over the caliphate and become custodian of the cities of Mecca and Medina. And in opposition to all of this, in order to create a distinctly Iranian identity, Ismail imports Lebanese scholars who are part of the Twelver school of Shia Islam, or Aliism, and they form a new clerical intellectual elite to define a new identity of Iranian independence and Iranian statehood. And again, in terms of like a restoration, this is sort of bizarre, because you have an appeal to Iranian nationhood, which is coalescing around these Turkified groups by bringing in this foreign religion to define yourself in opposition for an other. All of these ostensibly contradictory elements put together to form the Safavid dynasty, and yet this is sort of the basis of the modern Iranian dynasty today. And this is well, of course, it's succeeded by the Asfahids and the Zand dynasty and the Qajar dynasty, and eventually the Pahlavi dynasty, which was deposed in 1979. These states do claim, interestingly enough, some continuity with the House of Sasan, and even more sort of strangely all the way to the Achaemenids. And yet, as we can see, this state, appealing to the idea of Iranian nationality, the expansive state of Iran, is almost like a complete novel invention, masquerading as a form of restoration. So I think, again, in terms of creating all of these new ideas, this creates many sort of questions for us, which is how can this be a restoration when at the same time it doesn't represent an ethnically sort of Iranian dynasty. It doesn't represent the restoration of the ancient religion. It is fundamentally different. And you can say this about the Christianization of Rome as well. How does the sort of element of restoration or reaction reconcile itself to these fundamental societal changes, and yet still fundamentally identify itself as a restoration, in this case an Iranian restoration?
It's very, very interesting in the case of Iran. I think that warrants its own sort of exploration. A thing that occurs to me immediately is that, when of course, the Sassanids have been fighting endlessly with the Byzantines, the surviving Roman Empire. But of course, it was the Muslims who came up who raised all holy hell there and did conquer them. But to what extent is a very interesting question, because of course the Twelvers are just one of the many Shiite groups. For those of our viewers, I know you're aware of this, AM, but for those of our viewers who might not know, Shiism is fundamentally the idea that rulership of the religious community should continue through bloodlines, whether an occulted imam or actual descendants of the prophet. So that's the bloodline idea, whereas the Sunnis assert that the community, the Ummah, should choose the leaders. Well, there's an interesting thing that happened with the Persians, because they stuck with sort of the Indo-European idea of the bloodlines. It's not exclusively Indo-European, but this big focus on noble houses, sort of manifests to some extent in Shiism. And so though the Persians were conquered, they continued to assert themselves in some sort of occulted or underground ride the tiger kind of fashion. You have the Seveners, like the Ismaili, the Nizari Ismaili Shiite group, the ones who give us the Old Man of the Mountain or Hassan Sabah. And even in the face of Seljuk military power, they're coming down from their mountain fastnesses in disguise and assassinating people, giving us the word assassin, as in point of fact, most famously killing Nizam al-Mulk. But then you have the Mongols come in, and one thing you can say for the Mongols is that they fully enacted proscription. They simply leveled everything. They even took down Alamut. And yet the Mongols didn't survive, and these weird heterodox strands in the Muslim world that come out of Persia continue to survive. You've got 12ers, you've got 5ers in Yemen, you've still got 7ers in the form of the Aga Khan, and they're far flung, in East Africa or in Pakistan and the rest, but they continue to survive. And, on this theme, what I'm trying to underscore here is the idea that these Persians, they chose to take it offline. They deterritorialized their Persianness, and they seem to be, in their most recent incarnation, surviving in this occulted fashion with Babism, or the Baha'i, which is a global religion that's growing very, very swiftly. And they actively engage in sort of, I guess, conversion or missionary activities around the world for all ethnic groups. And yet it's fundamentally a sort of a Persian, very, very much a Persian version of some Islamic and Shiite ideas that have had the Muslim elements sort of stripped from them to make it accessible to people around the world. So all I'm trying to say is, at the end here, this business with Iran is very, very interesting, because despite the sort of aspects that you mentioned here at the end, they found a way to have fundamental aspects of their religious ideology survive in Babism or the Baha'i faith, simply by sort of stripping it of its, or deterritorializing it in some fashion. And it continues to survive. It's just a very interesting thing. I think it goes back to the cunning, the idea of taqiyya. You go back to even an ancient Persian king like Cyrus. I corresponded once with a Baha'i who was mentioning to me, because I was looking into the roots of taqiyya, or permissible dissimulation, as a strategy. And this Baha'i scholar had looked back to the roots of Persian customs with Cyrus, where he would not remove the existing gods of a people. He would simply insert himself into the pantheon. So it's almost like flavors of pseudographia, as a strategy. Whereas if you look at, for example, the Jews, they don't often talk about what happened after the walls of Jericho came down in the song, which is that, man, woman, and child, everybody was slaughtered. So there's something there in terms of a technique that can be used to survive in the face of this overwhelming force, which is sort of to go underground and to embrace dissimulation as a way to have one's ideas survive. I realize that's not really sort of one of the fundamental themes that we were exploring, but it's an interesting thing that comes out at the end, particularly when we look at the various types of restoration, regime restoration, internal restoration, state restoration, these kinds of things that you've mentioned. So perhaps that's something to consider further on, under the Ride the Tiger rubric. But I do want to ask you, AM, since we've come up on the end of this, and you've been talking almost without stop, and somehow managing to make it very, very interesting and informative at the same time. Do you have any final remarks you'd like to make, or any final observations?
No, I think your wonderful assessment of the continuity of this Iranian Ride the Tiger mentality is actually quite a good way, in my view, of summarizing all the various forms of reaction and how to survive and how to endure throughout this whole process, and how we can affect restorations. And I do believe it's possible. I may have been, rather depressing throughout this stream, but hopefully I've given some people, food for thought, especially, to avoid certain mistakes, if nothing else.
Right. Learning what not to do. Well, I do want to say this is a cracking good stream, as you Brits would say, and absolutely top drawer. I want to take this opportunity to ask everybody who has stuck with us all this time, please go now to Apostolic Majesty's channel. Apostolipstick. Yes, sorry. Yeah, and my favorite, man. Oh, wow, my favorite. Caligula. Yeah. Please go to his channel and subscribe. Absolutely excellent channel, excellent guest. Very, very happy to have him on. I hope that all of you will do the only sensible thing, which is to go and subscribe to his channel. It also occurs to me that I really should do a shout out for Academic Agent. Many of these guests I've had on are people that I first became aware of because he had them as guests on his channel. Props to him. Please check him out. I'm guessing everybody here is already well aware of him since he's a larger channel, much better known than I am. But if you don't know him, please head over there and follow him. Lots of great guests, people I've subsequently had on, people like John D. Pharaoh. Lots of excellent folks. So Apostolic Majesty, thank you very, very much, sir.
And thank you very much for that shill on my behalf.
Indeed.
So yes, absolutely. Thank you. And thank you for having me on. And as you can probably tell, I enjoy talking and thinking about this particular topic.
Yes, you arrived prepared. From now on, I'm hoping, actually, I'll say this as a last shill, just because great guest, great work, great energy and effort, and a lot of background reading that went into this. If there are any people listening from channels larger than my own, I'm beginning now to think of Apostolic Majesty as kind of like the wolf in Pulp Fiction. If there's anything where you have to delve into history, and there are many good historians out there. I'd also promote Otto Pohl's channel.
Absolutely.
But if you ever need someone on your channel, consider having Apostolic Majesty on, and it's like calling the wolf. He simply arrives and shit gets taken care of. So yeah, thank you very much, AM. Thank you all. Excuse me. Thank you all very much for sticking with us this long. I appreciate it. I hope you'll be back for further episodes in this strategy series. Until next time, I am Semi-Agog, and I am out.